It was in the winter of 1941, as the bombs fell over London and shadows flickered across the city's broken walls, that Pamela Churchill stepped into the great unfolding story of the age. A young woman still, but one already touched by fate, she entered the corridors of power with a grace that seemed at once natural and studied, a quiet flame whose light drew eyes even as the world darkened with war. Welcome, dear listener, wherever you may find yourself tonight. Perhaps you listen in a quiet room, or as sleep begins to draw you into softer realms. Tell us in the comments where you join this gathering, so that together we weave a network of memory, reaching across time and place. And should you wish these stories to continue their journey, let your hand press upon the button of subscription, that others too may sit by this fire of remembrance. The child who would one day be known as Pamela Churchill was born Pamela Beryl Digby in 1920 in the gentle countryside of Dorset, where the rolling fields met the sea with a muted harmony. Her family, though touched by noble connections, carried less of the wealth that often sustains nobility, and thus her childhood was one of both privilege and restraint. She learned early the art of appearing as though she belonged to the higher worlds, while quietly aware that the fortunes of her household could not always support such appearances. In this balance of display and reality, she found her first training in the subtle performance that would later define her life. The air of Dorset, soft with the salt of the Channel, lingered on her clothes, and one might imagine her as a girl walking the long hedgerows, eyes already searching not only the earth at her feet, but horizons further away, horizons that shimmered with promise. It was said of her youth that she carried herself with a beauty that was not fragile, but alive, her complexion carrying the warmth of English summers, her eyes quick and observant. In the gatherings of county society, she stood out not merely for appearance, but for her willingness to listen, to draw forth the words of others, and to let them feel their own significance mirrored in her gaze. Beauty opens doors, but the ability to make another believe in their own importance keeps those doors open. Whether she learned this truth by instinct or through silent observation, it was a gift she bore from her earliest years. And yet, was it a gift or a burden hidden in disguise? For every charm has its price, and each act of perception lays a quiet weight upon the heart of the perceiver. The world of Pamela's youth was not a world at peace. The rhythms of rural England seemed steady, yet the echoes of the First World War had not entirely faded, and the drumbeat of another conflict sounded faintly across Europe as she entered her 20s. In such times, young women of beauty and intelligence were often guided toward advantageous marriages, and Pamela was no exception. In 1939, as the storm of war broke across the continent, she met Randolph Churchill, the only son of Winston Churchill. He was older, brash, impulsive, and known for his restlessness. To marry into the Churchill family was to tie oneself to the great destiny of Britain itself, for Winston was already a figure of immense significance, his voice preparing to carry a nation through fire and ruin. Their wedding took place in 1939 under the shadow of war's beginning. Pamela, scarcely 19, stepped into the role of wife with a mixture of anticipation and unease. Randolph was not an easy husband. His passions were many, his debts heavy, his nature unpredictable. Yet to stand beside him was to stand at the threshold of power, and perhaps she sensed that her life, once bound to the gentle hills of Dorset, now moved on a different course. Within months, Randolph was dispatched to serve overseas, leaving Pamela in England, alone, yet not without attention. For the Churchill family, she became a figure of interest, and in London society she was observed, admired, and spoken of as the young bride, whose beauty softened the stern features of politics and war. And here the first threads of scandal began to weave themselves into her tapestry. For loneliness, in wartime, London was heavy and companionship often fleeting. Bombs fell, lights were dimmed, and each evening could be a farewell. In such an atmosphere, affections burned quickly, and loyalties sometimes blurred. Did Pamela choose to step into new affections, or was she swept into them by circumstance? Accounts differ, and perhaps no one, not even she, could say with certainty. What is known is that during those years, she moved within circles where leaders and envoys gathered, her presence both ornamental and significant. She was young, and she was seen, and in being seen, she began to realize the quiet power of her presence. Randolph, meanwhile, remained distant in more than geography. Their union, though bearing the name of Churchill, was marked less by closeness than by tension. His temper was strong, his fidelity questionable, and his understanding of Pamela's solitude minimal. Thus the marriage, though binding in name, became in reality a vessel for other currents. Pamela, observing the world with clear eyes, may have recognized that her life would not be defined by being merely the wife of Randolph. She was too vivid, too attuned to the possibilities that opened when charm and circumstance aligned. The question was not whether she would step into those possibilities, but how and with whom. In this first chapter of her journey, what emerges most is the figure of a young woman learning that life offers roles but does not dictate how they are played. She had been given the role of wife, of daughter-in-law to a man who would soon become one of the century's towering figures. Yet she sensed, perhaps before others did, that her script was her own to write. A candle lit in Dorset had been carried into the heart of war-torn London, and the flame had not diminished. Instead, it glowed brighter against the dark. But flames, when they glow too brightly, can also draw shadows, and shadows were already beginning to lengthen around her name. The halls of Chartwell, the Churchill estate, bore witness to many conversations during these years. Some voices praised Pamela's poise, others muttered about her choices, yet all agreed on one thing: she was impossible to ignore. Even in her early 20s, she was a presence one felt, not merely a figure one saw. It is said that destiny sometimes announces itself not with thunder, but with a whisper that lingers. And perhaps in those quiet corridors, as she moved softly across the floorboards, the whisper of her destiny began to echo. A door closes quietly in Chartwell, echoing into the restless night, and the sound seems to travel with her to London, where the windows are shaded and the streets wear their dim coats of blackout, and where the footsteps of strangers pass like brief, unrecorded thoughts. In the city, the air tastes of coal and cordite and rain, and the lamps are painted with darkness. And on some evenings there is a tremor under the ground, as if the earth itself were a living creature, holding its breath. She learns the measure of these nights the way a singer learns a note, the moment the siren begins, the slow descent to shelter, the return up narrow stairs when the all-clear lifts like a timid curtain. There are hours when she stands at a window and watches the glimmer of moonlight on the Thames through a gap in the blinds and feels the river go past with its own memory, older than starlight, older than war. She keeps a small notebook where she writes what food is available, which shops still have stockings, how the milk tastes when it sits too long in the cold, and out of such small details she builds a raft to carry her across unfamiliar water. She writes letters to Randolph with a patient hand, the nib ticking like a distant metronome, and the letters say what a wife is meant to say and also what a woman must say to herself when the house is too quiet and the night too long. She hears the names of places he has gone to that she has never seen, and she hears the names of men he serves with whom she will never meet. And in those names there is a kind of distance that cannot be crossed by paper alone. When morning comes, London smells of wet stone and singed timber, and the pavements are dusted with the previous night. She walks with a certain composed grace that does not deny the strain but does not confess to it either. And when she meets the wives and mothers at the grocer or the post office, there is a shared nod, the old language of endurance. There are days she calls on her elders by marriage, and in those rooms she learns the weight of silence, the way older faces hold the news and turn it like a coin between careful fingers. She sits sometimes in the corner of a room where decisions are only hinted at, and hears the murmured cadence of telephones, the pause before a message is repeated, the steady line of a pencil underlining a word that must not be misread. She is young, but she is not deaf to the current, and she can feel the pull of power like a tide, even when its surface is smooth. At tables lit by candles set in glass, she meets men whose collars are starched and whose eyes are red with fatigue, and their laughter is a thin fabric stretched over worry. Some of these men are soldiers on leave who smell of oil and leather, who speak in short sentences as if every word has been rationed and must be used well. Others are envoys whose hands are soft and whose voices are careful, who admire the city for its stubborn light and admire her for the way she appears to belong in any room she enters. She learns not to ask names unless they are offered, and not to remark on the maps that lie open like sleepless minds upon polished tables. She learns the quiet art of listening to two conversations at once, the one that mouths the surface and the one that moves beneath. And she learns that it is sometimes kinder to listen than to speak, and sometimes wiser to say nothing at all. In such company, her beauty is like the linen laid out before supper, clean and inevitable. But it is her attention that keeps eyes returning. She remembers birthdays and the small preference for a certain tea. She knows how to draw out a story from a man who has forgotten he still knows how to tell one. And when she laughs, it is with restraint, as if to say that mirth is a guest we must treat gently in a house that has known too much sorrow. She is not yet the talk of every corridor, but she is no longer invisible. And in a city where survival is a craft, she practices the stitch that keeps fabric from fraying. Some call it instinct, some call it ambition, and perhaps it is both. And perhaps the words do not matter as much as the shelter they create. For where does a young woman place her fear, if not inside a skill that distracts the eye and steadies the hand? On certain afternoons she holds her infant son and feels the surprising weight of a new life, warm and absolute, and in his sleeping face the world briefly pauses. The room smells of milk and linen. The soft thunder of traffic is a cradle song, and for a while she is only a mother in a chair by a window, counting the faint pulse at his temple. Yet even this hour is not free of the wider weather. The post brings headlines and telegrams, the neighbors speak of the last street that was hit, and the city resumes its stern conversation. She learns the old paradox that love is both a refuge and a reminder of loss. And she holds the child closer, not to escape the world, but to meet it without trembling. On night watches, when the baby will not sleep, she walks the floor with slow steps and listens to the far engines moving in the sky, not in fear, not even in resignation, but in an ancient recognition that we are all visited by forces larger than our rooms. In rooms where the curtains are drawn all day, long tables are laid with china and bread and pickled salmon, and the seating plan is drawn with a cartographer's care. She is placed between a journalist whose voice carries the dryness of ink and a naval officer whose cuff bears the salt of recent seas. They talk of convoys as if of caravans crossing a history no one wishes to write. They talk of machines with wings and machines without wings, and through it all the gentle machinery of social grace ticks on. She offers the journalist a folded napkin when his pen leaks. She asks the officer about the taste of tea at dawn on the open water, and she stores away his answer. For later, she will need the flavor of such words to season her own recollection. There are moments when the candles tilt and make strange shadows of their faces, and in those shadows the men look briefly like boys who have wandered too far from home and are ashamed to say so. Her husband writes with a heat that crosses deserts and oceans, but his words burn quickly and leave ash. There are accusations and appeals in the same envelope, and the tone turns one way and then the other like a compass near iron. She answers with patience because she fears the harm of adding flame to flame, but even patience has its own taste of defeat. When she sets down the pen, her hand shakes a little, and she puts it on the cool rim of her teacup and waits for the tremor to pass. In her waiting, there is a decision that does not show itself as a shout or a vow, but as a change in temperature. Like a room when the fire has been stoked quietly and no one has noticed until the chill has gone. In those days, the Americans begin to appear in greater number. Tall men with a different ease in their stride, their coats cut a little broader, their jokes a little more free. They look at the city with an affection that is also a study, and some of them look at her with a gaze that measures without seeming to measure. With some, she speaks of music and the way European waltzes differ from the tunes brought from across the ocean. With others, she speaks of bread lines and the patience of Londoners. And with a very few, she speaks almost not at all, because silence is sometimes the thicker bond. A rumor grows, as rumors often do, watered by boredom and salt, that the young Mrs. Churchill has a talent for attracting those who matter. But what does it mean to matter, and who decides it, and how much of mattering is only the echo of a name in a corridor at the right hour? She learns to receive the rumor without accepting it, the way one nods to a drizzle and keeps walking, because the road will not shorten itself. At times, she visits houses where the carpets are thick enough to quiet a footstep, and in those houses, she feels the breath of old money and the way old money behaves in a crisis, with a calm that can appear like charity or like indifference, depending on the angle of the eye. She is offered a fur to keep the cold from her shoulders, and she refuses it at first and then accepts it later when the wind presses through the walls and the bones begin to ache. She says little on these visits and sees much. The way a painter collecting the tones of a winter street does not speak the colors aloud. She notices which host looks first at the guest list and which looks first at the pantry. And she notices that in this war, kindness has learned to share its face with calculation, and that both can sit at the same table without quarrel. Her reputation grows like ivy, climbing without hurry, and when she catches it out of the corner of her eye, she cannot tell whether it is a greening comfort or a slow intrusion. Women who nod to her at luncheon measure the distance between their smile and their judgment with a seamstress needle, and the men who rise when she approaches do so with a chivalry that is also a signaling. She feels the warmth of being chosen and the chill of being regarded, and she learns the balance a dancer learns upon a floor where the music can stop without warning. At night, she attends a small concert in a gutted church where the violinist plays with a passion that softens the damaged walls, and she thinks as the bow moves that perhaps grace is only endurance expressed through the body, and perhaps the grace for which she is praised is only a type of endurance that happens to shine. There is an evening when she is asked to pour wine at a table where serious men are speaking very softly, and she accepts without comment because refusal would be noticed. She moves in a circle behind their chairs and fills crystal that rings faintly like thin bells, and as she does so, she hears fragments of phrases that will appear in newspapers long after the words have aged. She does not repeat them. She does not even rehearse them in her mind. What she keeps is not the wording, but the pressure in the room, a kind of gravitational field that holds everyone at a certain pitch of attention. Later, she will sit by the fire and think of how power can feel like warmth one moment and weight the next, and whether a human being can ever touch it without taking on some of its imprint. She does not chase the thought to its conclusion, because conclusions are hard on sleep and sleep is scarce. The winter deepens, then lifts, then returns, and time takes on the humor of a tide that faints and then flows. Her face grows a little older in the mirror and her eyes a little calmer, and she sees that calm is a mask she has learned to wear not to deceive, but to survive. If she seeks company, it is not always for flirtation and not always for strategy. Sometimes it is simply to sit in a room where the air is shared and the voices surround her with a reminder that life continues to do what it has always done, even here, even now, and that the heart can sometimes be comforted by the ordinary noise of forks and chairs and the small cough a man makes when he does not wish to interrupt. On one such night, as the hour leans toward midnight and the candles sink and a last plate is cleared, she stands at the edge of a corridor and waits for her cloak, and there in the half-light someone passes near her and speaks in a tone too low to fix with certainty, a remark that could have been praise or warning or both at once, and it hangs in the air like a thread, and as she turns toward the sound, she sees only a shoulder slipping into dimness, and then nothing, and only the suggestion remains that London has learned her name and is deciding what to do with it, while a voice whispers in a dimly lit corridor, not yet silenced. A voice whispers in a dimly lit corridor, not yet silenced, and it seems to follow her down staircases where the paint has blistered from damp and the walls carry the smell of soot and polish. That whisper is the overture to what would become her first great entanglement, the affair that would bind her name not only to the Churchill family, but to the shifting balances of diplomacy and desire. For in those anxious London nights, when the embassies stayed lit past dawn and the knock of a heel on marble could echo like a secret, she encountered Averell Harriman. He was older, seasoned in the world of finance and politics, a man whose authority had been tempered not by youth's flame, but by long decades of calculation. His eyes were steady, his smile worn like a practiced emblem, and yet to the young Pamela he must have appeared as both a protector and a puzzle, a figure of certainty in a city of uncertainty. Their paths crossed first in the settings where wine glasses trembled faintly in their saucers, and where curtains were drawn against the trembling sky. He listened to her with a patience that suggested her words mattered more than they might, and she listened to him with a curiosity that was not wholly feigned. In his company, she felt the calm of someone accustomed to decision, someone who had seen great movements of commerce and state, and who therefore treated war's immediacy with a composed gravity. For a woman left alone by her husband's absence, for a bride scarcely past girlhood, the assurance of such company could become a gravity of its own. There are those who claim that the affair was inevitable, that in the loneliness of blacked-out London, where death might descend with a single shriek from the sky, people sought comfort without waiting for the slow approval of convention. Others whispered more harshly that she sought influence through intimacy, that her beauty was a currency as tangible as any coin. But must every act of closeness be measured against a scale of ambition? And can we ever untangle the longing for touch from the longing for survival? It is easier to judge from a distance than to sit in a cold room and hear the city trembling and know that no letter from abroad will warm the pillow beside you. The presence of Harriman in her life altered the texture of her days. She was invited more often to the houses where polished silver shone even in wartime, where the conversation balanced between laughter and strategy, where one hand might rest lightly upon her arm even as the other traced lines on a map. She learned how men of power disguised their worry with wit, how they used silence as a form of punctuation, and how quickly an atmosphere could shift when news arrived from the front. She was not there as a decision-maker, yet her very presence made her part of the atmosphere in which decisions were made. Power does not always announce itself with signatures and stamps. Sometimes it is simply the ability to alter the current of a room with a smile or a pause. In private, She and Harriman would walk in gardens, where the leaves lay damp and uncollected, where the fountains had ceased their music, and in those places the war seemed momentarily suspended. He would speak of America, of the vastness of its landscapes, of the confidence of its people, and she would answer with fragments of Dorset, with memories of hedgerows and sea spray. Two continents met in their conversation, and perhaps two hungers as well. The hunger of an older man for youth's flame, and the hunger of a younger woman for the steadiness of experience. Did she love him? Did he love her? Such questions, though natural, may miss the more subtle truth that what they shared was a sanctuary built out of need, and sanctuaries do not require love to be sacred. The affair was not invisible. In circles where whispers move faster than letters, her companionship with Harriman was noted, discussed, sometimes scorned, sometimes admired. Within the Churchill family itself, the matter brought unease. Randolph, when word reached him, was furious, but his own reputation for waywardness made his outrage difficult to crown with virtue. Winston, focused on the survival of the nation, treated such personal entanglements with a weary pragmatism, though it is said he remarked upon the imprudence of bringing gossip into the family name. And yet, even in the criticism, there was a reluctant acknowledgement that Pamela had entered a realm where few women of her age could walk, that she was living at the hinge between the intimate and the historical. To imagine her at this time is to picture a young woman dressed in silks, slightly worn by the ration years, her hair pinned carefully, her laughter arriving like a spark in rooms otherwise dimmed by fear. Around her sat men calculating the fate of continents, and she, with her presence alone, softened the edges of their calculations. One wonders, was she conscious of the role she played, or did she step into it as naturally as a singer stepping into song? Perhaps she sensed that charm is its own kind of instrument, one that plays upon the hidden strings of ambition and fatigue, and that her gift was to wield it with an ease that seemed unstudied. But such gifts, while they shine, also cast shadows. For each admirer there was a critic. For each hand extended in courtesy, another wagged in censure. Some called her a courtesan of the powerful, a phrase half poisoned, half admiring. Others described her as a survivor, and perhaps survival in itself is the truest ambition of all. It is tempting to place her within categories: mistress, opportunist, socialite. But human lives resist such easy enclosures. They flow like rivers, cutting new paths when the banks shift, and in the war years the banks shifted daily. What remains clear is that her liaison with Harriman marked the first of many moments when her personal choices aligned with the larger movements of history. As the bombs continued to fall, as London endured the Blitz, Pamela lived at the intersection of the private and the public, her affections becoming part of diplomatic gossip, her presence a matter noted by both allies and rivals. Perhaps in her own heart she still felt like the girl walking the Dorset lanes, searching for horizons, but in the eyes of others, she had already become a figure of intrigue. On some nights, returning to her rooms after long dinners, she would set down her cloak and listen to the ticking of the mantel clock. The child slept in another room, and the silence was heavy but not empty. She thought of Randolph, far away, perhaps drinking, perhaps gambling, perhaps writing letters that cut like knives. She thought of Averell, his face composed, his voice deliberate, his touch firm but not possessive. Between these two men stretched the line of her life, and she must have wondered which end she truly belonged to. Yet instead of an answer, she found only the sound of the clock, each tick an impartial witness. The affair with Harriman was no brief spark. It lasted across months, deepening in its own rhythm. There were moments of intimacy, but also of distance, for he was often occupied with duties that placed him beyond her reach. In those interludes, she experienced again the solitude of waiting, though now the solitude was more complex, for it was no longer only the absence of a husband, but the absence of a lover whose presence had become a form of refuge. How many nights did she lie awake, hearing the muted thunder of war above, and ask herself whether her life was drifting into scandal or into destiny? Such questions rarely offer themselves to be answered. And so the war went on, and with it her name became further entangled in the web of London society. She was no longer simply the daughter from Dorset, nor even merely the wife of Randolph Churchill. She was something else, an emblem, a rumor, a figure whose choices carried resonance beyond herself. The whisper in the corridor had become a murmur in drawing rooms, a murmur that would one day swell into a chorus. The scent of cigars lingers in the empty room, a haze that seems to curl around the furniture long after the men have gone, leaving behind a silence that feels heavier than their conversation. Smoke is a strange witness, rising gently and then dissolving into nothing, yet carrying with it the memory of each exhaled thought. Pamela, standing by the window once more, would have known that her presence in such rooms was spoken of not only in admiration, but in suspicion. For in the eyes of many she had crossed that subtle threshold where companionship became influence, and influence became its own kind of scandal. The word courtesan was never spoken loudly in her company, but it drifted at the edges of her reputation like smoke itself, difficult to seize yet impossible to deny. In post-war London and Washington alike, she began to be seen less as the innocent young wife abandoned by circumstance and more as the woman who moved with remarkable ease among men of power. Her beauty was not the fragile kind that trembles in need of protection. It was the kind that suggested a knowing strength, a capacity to endure the whispered remarks and the arched brows. Some women envied her, others resented her, yet few could ignore her. For she was not content to sit in a shadowed corner. Her presence was always in the center, yet in a way that seemed to place the spotlight not on herself, but on those around her. And so, the paradox. Was she simply reflecting the light of others, or was she the quiet source from which that light came? The nature of her relationships was endlessly dissected by those who believed they knew the truth, though truths in such matters are slippery and rarely whole. To some, she was a strategist, deliberately entwining herself with figures whose decisions shaped nations. To others, she was a woman of heart, lonely and searching, who could not bear the cold distances imposed by war and duty. And perhaps she was both. For human beings are not made of single motives, but of layered and sometimes conflicting needs. The hunger for affection, the hunger for security, the hunger for meaning, these do not arrive one after the other, but all at once. And in her choices, they may all have played their part. London itself seemed complicit in her transformation. The city was weary from war, its stones chipped, its roofs patched, its people hardened. It had seen too much loss to judge too harshly, yet it whispered, nonetheless, for gossip is the small luxury of the battered. In drawing rooms lit by thin lamps, her name was pronounced with an almost theatrical pause, and the sentence that followed could either damn or admire, depending on the speaker. There was fascination in her, not because she was the only woman to live unconventionally, but because she did so in the immediate orbit of the greatest names of her time. A woman whose hand might rest upon the arm of an ambassador, whose laughter might soften the edge of a diplomat's command. Such a woman, people felt, must somehow be wielding a power of her own. In this period, she learned what it meant to have her life no longer belong to herself alone. Every gesture was observed, every friendship speculated upon. The men she drew close to her were not ordinary men, and therefore neither were the consequences. Did she enjoy this strange prominence, or did it weigh upon her shoulders like an invisible cloak? One cannot say. What we do know is that she adapted, and adaptation is perhaps the truest measure of survival. Where another might have faltered under scrutiny, she grew more composed. Where others might have retreated into privacy, she moved further into society, as if daring the world to speak more loudly. There is a kind of courage in scandal, if courage means the refusal to let shame dictate the path ahead. And in Pamela's case, that courage was tempered with calculation. She was not reckless. She knew the cost of missteps. Yet she was also unwilling to fold herself into invisibility, unwilling to let her life be defined by a marriage that had already begun to wither. Randolph was absent not only in body but in fidelity, and his name, though heavy with history, offered little warmth to his young wife. Perhaps then her liaisons were not betrayals but substitutions, a way of crafting a life that the formal vows had failed to provide. Still, her growing reputation was not without danger. The line between admiration and disdain is thin, and women of her kind often discovered how swiftly society could turn. To be admired for one's charm is to live on a knife edge, for charm fades quickly when suspicion takes its place. And yet she did not retreat. Instead, she leaned into the very role that others tried to press upon her. If they would call her a courtesan of influence, she would make that influence tangible. Shaping rooms, shaping perceptions, and in her own subtle way, shaping the flow of history. But there were nights, we must imagine, when the mask fell away. Nights when she returned alone, removed her jewels, and sat before a mirror in silence. Nights when the silence was too complete, and the laughter of the evening echoed too hollowly in memory. In those moments, did she feel triumphant or bereft? Did she believe herself clever, or did she fear she was merely drifting on currents she could not control? The human heart rarely offers clear answers, and perhaps it was this ambiguity that gave her life its enduring fascination. Even now, so many decades later, the stories of Pamela Churchill are told with a kind of double vision. One sees in her either the cunning enchantress or the lonely survivor. Yet why must it be one or the other? Why not both? For within each of us lies the capacity for both cunning and loneliness, both strength and yearning. She embodied this duality openly, and for that reason she became both celebrated and condemned. In her, society glimpsed its own contradictions, and society punished her for holding up that mirror. In the stillness after the parties, when the ashtrays were full and the music had stopped, there remained only the faint glow of a candle guttering low. The wax bent, the flame wavered, and shadows stretched across the wall. Was she then a woman who had conquered her circumstances, or a woman who had been conquered by them? The candle did not answer. It simply burned and then lowered itself into darkness, leaving the question unresolved. A single candle burns low, leaving questions in the dark, and when the flame finally surrenders, what remains is the faint trace of wax cooling into stillness, the silence broken only by the soft creak of a house that seems itself to breathe. Out of that darkness arose the growing certainty that her marriage to Randolph could not endure, that whatever bond had once joined them had frayed beyond repair. Their union, begun in the anxious dawn of war, had carried within it too much distance and too little gentleness. Randolph had been absent more than present, restless more than rooted, and the promises of fidelity he once made were scattered easily in the wind of his own appetites. Pamela, though young, had already grown accustomed to solitude, and in solitude the heart often learns its own strength, but also its own indifference. The separation between them was not sudden, but slow, like a river eroding its banks until the land no longer recognizes its own shape. Letters grew more strained, conversations more brittle. By the time he returned to London in intervals, his presence was less comfort than disruption, a reminder of obligations that neither wished to honor fully. Randolph's debts mounted. His behavior turned ever more reckless, and his pride, wounded by whispers of her companionship with other men, made him lash out with an anger that neither healed nor changed the truth. And so it became inevitable. The wife and husband, who had once been celebrated at their wedding as a union of two notable families, now stood apart, joined in name only. For Pamela, the dissolution of her marriage brought not liberation alone, but estrangement. Within the Churchill family there was disappointment, for Winston, though immersed in the fate of nations, understood the cost of scandal when attached to his household. Clementine, his wife, was stern and traditional in her judgments, and she viewed Pamela's conduct with cool disapproval. In the family circle, Pamela felt the subtle chill of disfavor, the sense of being both present and unwelcome. To belong to such a family was to live in the shadow of greatness, but also in the glare of expectation, and Pamela no longer fit the mold they had wished for her. Yet if her place within the Churchills diminished, her place in society seemed only to grow. The very scandal that caused estrangement also made her more visible, more discussed, more woven into the tapestry of post-war intrigue. There is an irony in how society treats its rebels. To some they are condemned, to others admired, and often to the same people in alternating breaths. Pamela became one of those figures whose reputation was never secure, but always alive, a name that carried both condemnation and fascination. She was excluded by some doors only to be invited more eagerly through others. Perhaps she learned in these years that acceptance and rejection are merely two faces of the same coin, and that the wise do not cling too tightly to either. Still, one must not forget that beneath the glamour and gossip lay a woman of flesh and uncertainty. She had a child to raise, and in his face she found both solace and responsibility. There were days when she walked with him in the parks of London, the trees scarred by shrapnel yet still putting forth leaves, and in such moments she was not courtesan nor scandal, but simply a mother holding a small hand, and yet even motherhood could not shield her from the gaze of others. Each decision she made, each step she took, was read as part of the larger story that society was writing for her, often without her consent. Estrangement from the Churchills did not mean erasure, however. Winston himself, though he may have been displeased, was not without his own complex understanding of human weakness. He had seen too much of life, and perhaps in his more private reflections, he recognized in Pamela a determination that echoed his own, though hers expressed itself through charm rather than through speeches or battles. And so the relationship, though strained, was never wholly severed. She remained a thread in the fabric of their history, though never woven as tightly as before. The years following her separation brought with them both loneliness and opportunity. Without the official title of Churchill wife, she was free to chart her own path, yet that freedom came at the price of greater scrutiny. She entered a liminal space, neither entirely within the protective sphere of family, nor entirely outside it, a figure who belonged everywhere and nowhere at once. It is often in such spaces that individuals craft their most enduring identities, and Pamela was no exception. She was no longer the shy girl from Dorset, nor the dutiful bride of 1939. She was now something else, something forged by war and scandal, by love and disappointment. She began to move more frequently across the Atlantic, weaving connections in America as easily as she once had in England. The charm that drew attention in London drew it as strongly in New York and Washington, and there she found new circles eager to welcome her. Yet even as she crossed oceans, the memory of her estrangement lingered. To be cast out, however gently, leaves an imprint on the heart, and one wonders if she carried with her always the echo of that loss, the unspoken ache of no longer fully belonging to the great household whose name she still bore. In these years, the question of her identity must have pressed itself upon her. Was she a wife abandoned, a lover sought, a mother devoted, a courtesan admired? Was she all of these at once or none? Human beings live within stories told about them, yet those stories rarely align with the one they tell themselves. Pamela's story, at least in this season of her life, seemed fractured between the public narrative of scandal and the private desire for stability. Perhaps she found in companionship, however fleeting, the answer to that fracture, or perhaps she merely disguised it with laughter and elegance. The countryside of England, when she visited, seemed to echo differently now. The hedgerows she had walked as a girl no longer whispered of horizons to be reached, but of innocence left behind. In Dorset, she was remembered as the daughter of familiar faces, yet even there, her reputation preceded her, transformed by distance into myth. She had become more story than person, more rumor than daughter. Such transformations are rarely reversible. Once society has turned a living being into a symbol, the person herself is forever altered. Still, symbols can be wielded, and Pamela, consciously or not, began to wield hers. She allowed the scandal to accompany her as a kind of cloak, drawing attention even as it repelled. She had learned that scandal, like fire, can consume but can also illuminate. And so she moved forward, not timidly, but with a kind of graceful defiance. If doors closed, she knocked upon others. If voices condemned, she smiled in the direction of those who praised. It was not happiness, perhaps, but it was survival, and survival is its own form of triumph. The wind rustles across country fields, carrying an unfinished promise, and that same restless movement seemed to carry Pamela toward new shores, toward a wider world that waited beyond the hedgerows of England. The war was over now, though its shadow lingered in the ruins of cities and in the eyes of men who had survived too much. London bore its scars openly, streets torn and patched, hearts not yet mended. Yet in the midst of reconstruction, people sought not only to rebuild houses and governments, but to rebuild the fabric of society itself. And in that fabric, Pamela found herself once more woven, not tightly, not predictably, but in a pattern that crossed borders and oceans. The post-war years drew her toward America with an almost magnetic pull. The nation had emerged from the war with its power strengthened, its optimism vast, its wealth plentiful compared to the austerity of Europe. In the salons of New York and the diplomatic halls of Washington, she discovered rooms filled with energy, unlike the weary elegance of London. Here, men spoke with more confidence, women dressed with greater daring, and fortunes seemed to turn overnight. Pamela carried with her the allure of the old world, the accent of Dorset softened by London, the history of being a Churchill by marriage, and above all the reputation that preceded her, like an invisible herald. Wherever she appeared, whispers soon followed, not only of her beauty but of the men she had known, the men who had known her, and the strange question of whether she was a guest, a companion, or an influence all her own. It is said that she arrived in America with nothing more than charm, and perhaps charm is more than enough. She was received at tables where magnates spoke of railroads and steel, where politicians plotted campaigns and measured their chances, and where actors and actresses mingled with ambassadors. In these gatherings, she wore her reputation like a veil, translucent, revealing just enough to tempt the eye, concealing just enough to invite speculation. She learned again what she had always known instinctively, that to be remembered is a kind of power, and that the content of remembrance is less important than the persistence of the memory itself. But beyond charm, there was adaptability. Pamela had the rare gift of moving between worlds that were often closed to one another. She could sit beside a tycoon and listen to the language of profit, then turn and engage a senator in reflections on policy, then lean across to an actor and laugh at the absurdity of fame. In each case, she seemed genuinely present, and perhaps she was. Yet one wonders whether, in offering herself so fully to the voices of others, she ever felt her own voice slipping away. Was her identity merely the reflection of the powerful men around her, or was she shaping her own story through them? The question lingers like a faint perfume, pleasant but elusive. She remained closely connected to Averell Harriman, whose life had long since merged with hers in a web of intimacy and strategy. In America, his stature was immense, his influence considerable, and through him she entered circles of consequence. Yet her ties were not confined to him alone. She was seen with others whose names carried weight in banking, in politics, in Hollywood. Always she seemed to stand at the crossroads of power and desire, as though fate itself had appointed her the custodian of that intersection. To some, she was opportunist, to others, muse. To herself, perhaps, she was simply continuing the path that circumstance and survival had opened. What marked these years was her emergence not merely as a companion of the powerful, but as a figure who could not be separated from the image of power itself. At parties where champagne sparkled in tall glasses and laughter seemed to push away the memory of war, Pamela was present, dressed elegantly, her face a reminder of a Europe that still carried old sophistication. Men sought her not only for her company, but for the aura she brought with her, the sense that to be seen with her was to borrow a little of the world's intrigue. In this sense, she was no longer simply a woman moving within society. She had become a symbol, an emblem of glamour laced with scandal, of beauty carrying the weight of politics, of desire cloaked in diplomacy. And yet, what is it to live as a symbol? Does it not demand a cost? When each gesture is interpreted as intention, each smile as strategy, each friendship as advantage, can one ever rest within the simplicity of being oneself? Perhaps in moments of solitude, in the quiet of a room when the gowns were folded and the lights extinguished, she felt the weight of that mask. Perhaps she asked herself whether love could be real if it was always entangled with ambition, whether friendship could be pure if it was always shadowed by calculation, or perhaps she made peace with ambiguity, deciding that in a world rebuilt by compromise, the heart too must learn to live within compromise. These years also revealed the extent to which she could transform her own image. Once condemned as a scandalous mistress, she began to be seen in some circles as a hostess of refinement, a woman who could bring together people who might otherwise never meet, a bridge between Europe and America, between politics and society. To be such a bridge is not a simple role. It requires poise, memory, discretion, and the willingness to be noticed while revealing nothing. Pamela possessed all these. She was not the first woman to play such a part, nor would she be the last, but few did so with such consistency across decades. There is an image of her, often recalled, standing at the edge of a balcony in New York as the evening lights rise in their thousands, reflecting in her eyes like a field of stars. The city hums below, restless, unceasing, while she holds a glass lightly in her hand, speaking with a man whose name is written in newspapers. Around her, people laugh, a piano plays faintly from inside, and yet she seems apart, as if she is both present and absent, both participant and observer. That image, whether imagined or real, captures the paradox of Pamela in these years, central to the moment, yet somehow beyond it, her own story unfolding not in direct lines but in delicate, elusive arcs. Her connections deepened, her reputation solidified, and her presence became a fixture. She was no longer the young bride of wartime London. She was now an international figure, her identity forged as much by whispers as by truth. And as she moved through the post-war years, she seemed to carry with her the unfinished promise of that wind across the fields, the promise that she would not settle into obscurity, that her story was far from over, that each encounter was not an end, but another thread woven into a pattern still growing, still shifting. A telegram lies unopened, ink fading with time, its folded paper resting on a tray beside a vase of flowers, beginning to lose their fragrance. In that small emblem of distance, of words waiting to be read, lies much of Pamela's life in these post-war years, for messages reached her from across continents, voices calling her into new circles, new alliances, new encounters. And among those summonses came invitations not only from the realms of politics and diplomacy, but from the glittering yet equally precarious world of Hollywood, where light and shadow danced across silver screens, and where fame was as fragile as the paper of a telegram left too long in the sun. The years that followed saw her stepping easily between Washington and New York, but also drifting westward to California, where the air was scented with orange blossoms and the evening shimmered with a warmth unfamiliar to London's fog. Here she met men and women whose lives were crafted as much from myth as from truth, figures whose names would be spoken in darkened theaters across the globe. For Pamela, whose beauty had already become a story told in whispers, the allure of Hollywood was not foreign but familiar, for it too lived on the border between reality and imagination. She moved among actors who spoke their lines as if every dinner conversation were a rehearsal, and directors who looked at her as if framing her face in invisible lenses. Some were captivated by her accent, her European poise, the suggestion of history behind her manner. To them she was not merely another beautiful woman, but a link to a world of wartime intrigue and noble families, a woman who had sat in rooms with statesmen and ambassadors. And to her they offered a different kind of escape, a world where glamour was currency, where charm was not whispered about with suspicion, but celebrated as a profession. There are accounts that she became close with several leading men of the era, names that flickered on screens as heroes, lovers, adventurers. Whether these relationships were fleeting or lasting, whether they were affection or arrangement, remains uncertain. For Hollywood thrives on rumor as much as truth, and Pamela herself seemed to exist comfortably in that ambiguity. What mattered was not the accuracy of the stories, but the fact that she was woven into them, her name appearing in gossip columns alongside those whose faces adorned cinema posters. And yet, unlike many who drifted into Hollywood's orbit, Pamela did not become absorbed by it. She was not dazzled into losing herself. Instead, she carried her own mystique into those circles, letting the glamour of film add to her aura without ever replacing it. For she was never merely a guest in Hollywood. She was always something more. A woman whose identity had been shaped by the darker, heavier atmospheres of wartime politics, which lent her a depth often lacking in the sunlit shallows of celebrity. Perhaps that was her secret, that she moved among the stars not as one seeking their light, but as one bringing her own. Still, the mingling of glamour and politics was never simple. To be seen with film actors was to invite admiration from some and skepticism from others. Political men wondered whether such company diminished her seriousness, while actors perhaps wondered whether her ties to statesmen made her aloof. But Pamela seemed to thrive in these tensions, playing one world against the other, reminding each that the other was not so distant after all. For were not politicians actors of a different stage, their lines rehearsed, their audiences larger? And were not actors, in their own way, wielders of influence, shaping public imagination as surely as laws shaped public life? She had, by this time, mastered the art of being many things to many people without entirely surrendering the mystery of who she was to herself. In New York, she was the socialite at the ambassador's table. In Washington, the confidant of diplomats. In Los Angeles, the companion of stars. Each circle saw a fragment of her, but none possessed her whole. And perhaps this fragmentation was not a disguise, but the truth itself, that she was a woman of many selves, each one genuine in its moment, each one incomplete without the others. Her reputation as scandalous lingered. But in America, it began to take on a different color. In London, scandal clung like damp to the walls, heavy with disapproval. In Hollywood, scandal was a perfume, sharp yet enticing, an accessory to fame. What condemned her in one world elevated her in another, and so she learned to turn even judgment to her advantage, wearing her notoriety with an elegance that made it indistinguishable from honor. It is a rare gift to transmute condemnation into fascination, and Pamela, whether by instinct or design, possessed it fully. Yet amidst the laughter of cocktail parties, the flash of cameras, the music spilling from pianos in Beverly Hills mansions, one wonders whether she ever longed for the quieter landscapes of Dorset, the simpler truth of fields and waves. Was there ever a night when, looking across a swimming pool lit by floating candles, she thought of the moonlight on English hedgerows and felt the tug of an older, more innocent self? If so, she did not let it show, for the mask she wore in these years was one of delight, of energy, of forward momentum. She did not drift into nostalgia, at least not publicly. She let the past remain in shadows while she shone in the light of the present. Still, there is a cost to endless motion, to living always in rooms filled with laughter and never in rooms filled with silence. The telegrams continued to arrive, the invitations multiplied, but beneath them was the question that stalks all who live in perpetual company. When the music stops, who remains? In those moments of solitude, when the evening gown was hung and the jewels placed back into their velvet case, perhaps she asked herself whether the adoration of actors and the admiration of politicians were substitutes for love or simply reflections of power. But as ever, she gave no public answer. Her secret was to leave the question unresolved, to allow the mystery itself to be her identity. In this weaving of Hollywood and high society, of politics and performance, Pamela's story grew more complex, more layered. She was no longer defined by a single affair, a single family, a single role. She was now many stories at once, some true, some imagined, all alive. And in this multiplicity lay her strength, for while others could be diminished by gossip, Pamela seemed to grow larger within it. Her name carried farther, her image more vividly drawn. Music drifts faintly from a distant ballroom, its notes rising and falling like a tide that never reaches the shore, and in that music lies the echo of how Pamela was seen, admired, condemned, whispered about. Reputation, like melody, is carried on the air, never held in the hand, and hers became one of the most persistent tunes of the mid-20th century. To some ears, it was sweet, a song of charm and resilience, to others discordant, a warning against impropriety. But whether one hummed it with delight or shook the head in disapproval, few could silence it, for her name had become a refrain sung in salons, across newspapers and at dinners, where statesmen and actors alike leaned closer to hear the next verse. She was, in these years, a woman both sought after and spoken against, a paradox that seemed to define her existence. Men of influence found themselves drawn to her as though her very presence lightened the burdens they carried, and yet their wives, their colleagues, their peers muttered that she was dangerous, reckless, a woman who fed on scandal as others fed on bread. Such mutterings did not deter her, perhaps because she had learned early that condemnation and fascination are siblings, born of the same attention. To be ignored would have been far worse than to be criticized, and she was never ignored. The paradox of her reputation lay in its duality. On the one hand, she was seen as irresistible, her beauty and wit the subjects of endless description. On the other hand, she was cast as scandalous, her choices interpreted not as the search for affection, but as the pursuit of advantage. Yet perhaps these judgments reveal more about the society that passed them than about Pamela herself. For she lived in a time when women were expected to wield influence only through the shadows of marriage, never in their own right. To see a woman shape her destiny through relationships outside that framework was to see the rules unsettled, and unsettled rules provoke unease. Was she punished for her choices or for daring to make them at all? Pamela herself did not offer explanations. She did not write memoirs to defend her name, nor pen confessions to justify her path. Instead, she continued to live as she always had, stepping into rooms where she was both welcomed and whispered about, her head held high, her smile never forced, yet never careless. In this refusal to explain, she allowed her reputation to remain fluid, a story that others told but could never pin down completely. And perhaps that was her strategy all along, to let mystery be her shield. Imagine her walking into a drawing room where the carpet muffles footsteps and the chandeliers cast pools of light upon polished wood. Conversations falter as eyes turn, some with warmth, others with curiosity, a few with suspicion. She greets each with the same calm composure, offering just enough warmth to be remembered, just enough reserve to prevent easy assumptions. Later, when she has departed, the room will discuss her, each voice shaping her image anew, some insisting she is a temptress, others that she is a survivor, and none agreeing fully. She leaves behind not herself but a collection of impressions, and those impressions become the reality others live by. It is difficult to measure how much she cultivated this ambiguity and how much it was thrust upon her. Perhaps she was not calculating at every turn. Perhaps she was simply living as best she could, making choices in the moment without foreseeing how they would be magnified by gossip. But once magnified, she did not retreat. She adapted, embraced, even wielded the narrative that others spun around her. If they would call her scandalous, she would wear the word with elegance, transforming it from condemnation into allure. In this way, she turned judgment into a form of power, one that allowed her to remain at the center of attention long after many contemporaries had faded. Yet beneath the surface, what loneliness must have accompanied this role? To be constantly admired yet rarely trusted, constantly discussed yet rarely understood, is to live with a distance between the inner self and the outer image. Did Pamela ever long for someone to see her without the veil of reputation, to regard her not as scandalous nor irresistible, but simply as herself? Or had she, by this stage, become so accustomed to the performance that the performance itself was her truth? The question lingers, unanswered, perhaps unanswerable. And still, despite all the mutterings, invitations continued. She was not ostracized, for her presence remained too valuable. Men and women alike sought her at their tables, even as they criticized her in private. They wanted the sparkle she brought, the glamour she lent to gatherings, the subtle sense that history itself might be passing through their drawing rooms. Her reputation, scandalous as it was, had become inseparable from her allure, and to exclude her was to admit one's gathering lacked that special electricity. Thus she thrived, balanced precariously yet gracefully on the edge of acceptance and rejection, never falling fully into either. There is a curious power in being both condemned and desired, for it places one outside the ordinary rules. Pamela lived in that liminal space where the boundaries blurred, where the roles assigned by society could not contain her. And while others might have sought to repair their reputations, to cleanse themselves of gossip, she did not. She seemed to know that once a woman is labeled scandalous, she cannot erase the label. She can only redefine it. And redefine it she did, turning scandal from shame into spectacle, into a currency as potent as charm itself. But no currency is inexhaustible. As she moved deeper into this life, she must have sensed the fragility of her position. Scandal can be alluring while one is young and beautiful, but as years pass, it threatens to sour into ridicule. Did she worry about the future, about how long her magnetism could hold society's gaze? Perhaps. Yet perhaps, too, she trusted in her ability to transform again, as she had before, to shift her role from courtesan to hostess, from mistress to confidant, from scandal to stateswoman. The seeds of that transformation were already within her, though she herself may not yet have seen them. For now, she remained at the height of her allure, irresistible and scandalous in equal measure, the subject of admiration and judgment alike. And as she left yet another ballroom where the music had played until the candles burned low, she stepped carefully on marble floors, her heels striking softly. Behind her, the murmur of voices continued, some praising, some condemning, all remembering. And in that murmur, her reputation lived on, impossible to silence. A glass shatters softly against polished marble, the fragments scattering like small constellations upon the floor, each piece catching the light in a way that seems almost deliberate. For Pamela, the years that followed were themselves a scattering of fragments, moments of brilliance and reflection, shards of reputation and memory, each refracting her image into something slightly different depending on the angle from which it was viewed. By the 1950s and 60s, she had become not simply a woman connected to scandal, but a figure who seemed to be always present wherever influence was gathered, a constant at the very center of shifting constellations of power. The post-war world was reassembling itself into new patterns, empires fading, alliances forming, fortunes remade in the bright currency of commerce. America had become the dominant force, its voice louder than all others, while Europe struggled to mend its wounds. Pamela, who had once been only the young bride from Dorset stepping hesitantly into Churchill's orbit, now navigated these vast transformations with a surprising ease. She seemed to carry within her the ability to belong in any setting, to converse with captains of industry as readily as with the actors of Hollywood, to bring with her the residue of history while also embodying the glamour of the present moment. Her relationships continued to draw speculation, for she was rarely without companionship, and her companions were rarely ordinary. Tycoons whose names were etched upon banks and shipping lines, politicians whose speeches shaped national destinies, artists and actors whose faces were familiar to millions. These were the men drawn to her company. Some loved her with intensity, others admired her more distantly, but all recognized in her something that could not be easily defined. She was both participant and observer, both intimate and distant, her presence simultaneously reassuring and unsettling. The gossip that clung to her was never still, always reshaping itself. In London, she was still the scandalous young woman whose choices had unsettled the Churchill family. In Washington, she was seen as a hostess of subtle influence, a bridge between worlds. In Hollywood, she remained an emblem of European sophistication, carrying with her the suggestion of mystery and intrigue. And in each of these identities, she allowed herself to thrive, moving between them without being trapped by any single one. It is rare for a person to live multiple lives within a single lifetime, but Pamela seemed to manage precisely this, shedding and adopting reputations as though they were garments, yet always retaining the unmistakable poise that made each version of her seem authentic. The 1950s were not gentle years. They were filled with the anxieties of the Cold War, the tensions of empires unraveling, the new energy of cultures reinventing themselves. Pamela's presence in these times was not political in the direct sense, for she held no office, made no speeches, signed no treaties, yet her role was no less significant for its subtlety. For influence is not only wielded in parliaments and congresses, but also in the quiet hours after banquets, in the private conversations held behind closed doors, in the softened hearts of men whose decisions were shaped as much by personal comfort as by rational calculation. Pamela offered that comfort, that ease, that charm that allowed such men to imagine themselves stronger, more decisive, more admired, Was this manipulation, or was it a kind of gift? One cannot easily decide. Perhaps it was both, and perhaps Pamela herself never separated one from the other. By the 1960s, her life seemed almost mythic. She was no longer spoken of only in terms of scandal, but also in terms of legend. There was fascination in her survival, in her capacity to remain not only relevant, but central, as decades shifted and younger faces appeared. Where many women of her generation had retreated into private domesticity, Pamela remained in the spotlight, her name invoked whenever conversations turned to the intersection of love, power, and history. She had become more than a woman. She had become a story. And stories have their own kind of immortality. And yet, beneath the legend, there must have remained the human being, the woman who woke in the mornings and gazed into mirrors, who aged as all humans do, whose heart beat with the same fragile rhythms. To live as a constant presence in society is to give much of oneself away, to allow others to define you, to accept that the narrative of your life is no longer fully your own. Did Pamela mourn this loss of privacy, or had she so thoroughly merged with her public self that she no longer felt the absence of the private one? Again, we cannot know. The silence she left behind is louder than any answer. Still, the fact remains that she did not disappear. In an age when women attached to men of power were often discarded, forgotten, or hidden, she endured. She remained visible, memorable, undeniable. Even those who disapproved of her choices found themselves speaking her name, for scandal fades quickly unless accompanied by an aura of fascination, and Pamela's aura never dimmed. She had the rare ability to turn condemnation into curiosity, curiosity into admiration, admiration into myth. Think of her in these decades, stepping out of a sleek car into the bright lights of a New York hotel, cameras flashing, voices calling, her gown trailing just enough to suggest grace without extravagance. Think of her walking into a Washington reception, where senators straighten their ties and diplomats rehearse their phrases, knowing that in her presence the atmosphere shifts, the air sharpens. Think of her in Beverly Hills, the moonlight soft against her shoulders, actors pausing their laughter to watch her cross a garden. Always, she was central, yet always just beyond reach, her true self veiled by the very allure that drew others closer. The train of her life in these years seemed endless. Each station another city, another circle, another admirer, another whisper. The rhythm of motion became her rhythm, and perhaps the only constancy she knew was change itself. She lived in the flow of reputation and influence, never resting fully, never settling completely. A train whistle calls into the night, heading westward, carrying her story onward, its sound both mournful and determined, like the echo of a life always in transit, always moving toward the next chapter, the next encounter, the next reinvention. A train whistle calls into the night, heading westward, its low cry stretching across plains and cities as though announcing that another journey has begun. And in that sound, one can almost hear Pamela's own passage deeper into America, into the vast country that had, after the war, become the axis of the modern world. The whistle fades, but its echo lingers, just as her footsteps lingered in Washington's corridors, in New York's ballrooms, in the quiet drawing rooms where decisions about nations were made in tones that never rose above a whisper. It was here, across the Atlantic, that her long connection with Averell Harriman grew more visible, less an affair hidden in wartime shadows, and more a partnership that threaded its way through the machinery of American power. Harriman, older by decades, bore the demeanor of a man who had long since learned the rhythm of influence. He had been financier, statesman, ambassador, a figure whose signature had shaped treaties and whose gaze had measured markets. In him, Pamela found not only a lover, but a gateway, a way to stand within the very heart of power without ever needing to declare herself its holder. He admired her for her resilience, for her charm that seemed as instinctive as breathing, for her ability to make even the most hardened politician relax into confession. And she perhaps admired in him what she had never found in Randolph: steadiness, depth, a patience that did not turn to cruelty. By the 1950s and 60s, she had become something more than a guest in America. She was almost a fixture, a woman whose presence at dinners and receptions was expected, whose absence would have been remarked upon. She floated in that strange space between personal intimacy and political significance. Not an official, not a wife, yet always there, always seen, always remembered. To some, she was the silent architect of moods. To others, the elegant adornment of men in power. Yet behind those perceptions was a quieter truth. She had become a part of the way power itself moved, not dictating its course, but shaping the air through which it traveled. In Washington, she became known not only for her liaisons, but for her ability to host, to gather, to connect. A hostess is rarely given credit in history, yet history often leans on her presence. Pamela's salons and suppers, often described as glittering yet intimate, drew together men who might otherwise not have spoken, or whose guarded silences softened under the spell of charm and wine. She knew that influence often required less the clash of speeches than the weaving of threads in quieter hours. And so she wove. With a smile here, a recollection there, she tied one guest to another, letting affinities blossom that might later turn into alliances. Of course, whispers followed her still. Some said she was a manipulator, drawing advantage from every association, calculating her position as one calculates profit. Others saw her as a woman surviving in the only way available to her, denied by circumstance the traditional stability of family, yet unwilling to fade into obscurity. Which was true, perhaps both. Human beings live always in the tension between survival and ambition, and Pamela was no exception. What made her remarkable was her refusal to allow condemnation to erase her. She lived openly, visibly, refusing to apologize for the very qualities that others both envied and despised. It was in these American years that her reputation shifted yet again. She was no longer spoken of solely as the scandalous mistress. In some circles, she became the companion of diplomacy itself, a figure whose presence could not be disentangled from the flow of events. She was not in the headlines of treaties, but she was in the margins, in the photographs, in the recollections of those who remembered how a particular conversation began, not with a policy paper, but with a shared glance across her table. Influence, after all, is not only what is written in official minutes, it is also what is remembered in the silences between sentences. Her connection with Harriman deepened, though it was long before it became formalized in marriage. They moved together in society, their companionship understood, if not always openly acknowledged. He was, by then, an elder statesman, his career at once illustrious and slowing, while she remained vivid, a reminder of youth even as years passed. To see them together was to see a pairing of contrasts, his seasoned gravity, her luminous vitality, his past achievements, her present presence. Did he rely on her to keep him tethered to the world of energy and elegance? Did she rely on him to anchor her in respectability after years of rumor? It is likely both found in the other what they lacked alone. And so, in Washington townhouses and New York apartments, she lived at the heart of a world where politics was not only speeches and campaigns, but also dinners, whispers, alliances struck in drawing rooms. She learned to measure her words carefully, to let her laughter rise at the right moment, to turn conversations so subtly that no one realized they had shifted. Was this deliberate strategy or instinctive grace? The line is hard to see, yet the effect was undeniable. She had become, in the eyes of many, a woman whose company was as valuable as any official's counsel. Still, one imagines there were nights when she felt the weight of it. To be always observed, always speculated upon, is a kind of imprisonment even when gilded. She could never walk into a room simply as Pamela. She was always Pamela Churchill, Pamela Harriman's companion, Pamela the courtesan, Pamela the socialite, Pamela the hostess. Identity itself became fractured, refracted, lost in the kaleidoscope of perception. And yet, rather than resist, she embraced the kaleidoscope, moving within it as though it were her natural element. If she sometimes felt the emptiness of solitude, she concealed it with elegance. Her presence in America was a reminder that history itself is often lived not only in official documents, but in the daily breath of society, in the dinners and dances, in the whispered confidences, and the sudden trust offered in a softened moment. Pamela knew this, whether consciously or instinctively, and she played her part with unwavering consistency. She did not demand recognition, yet recognition came. She did not claim power, yet power hovered around her, drawn to her like iron to a magnet. As the years passed, she must have asked herself where this path would lead. Would she remain forever a companion, forever a hostess, forever a woman defined by the men she knew? Or would there be some other chapter, one in which she claimed her own position openly? The answers were not yet clear, but the questions began to form, like faint writing on paper waiting for ink to darken. The steady scratching of a pen on paper pauses, unresolved, and in that silence lies the measure of Pamela's middle years, when time itself seemed to pause around her, neither offering her final judgment nor releasing her from constant speculation. By the 1970s, she was no longer the young bride of Randolph, no longer the scandalous mistress of a wartime envoy, no longer even the new guest in America's glittering salons. She had matured into something stranger, something more ambiguous, a woman whose history was known and debated, yet whose presence still carried the freshness of intrigue. Critics had grown sharper with age, whispering that she lived only by attaching herself to the powerful, that she was a courtesan grown older, still plying the same currency. And yet those same critics invited her still, unable to resist the peculiar aura that surrounded her. She was a paradox in human form. In her 40s and 50s, while others of her generation slipped into obscurity, she remained central. She had learned that reinvention was survival, and she wore her years as gracefully as she had once worn her youth. Lines deepened around her eyes, yet the brightness within them seemed undimmed. Her smile remained quick, her laughter retained its precision, and her intelligence, often underestimated, revealed itself more clearly than before. Where once she had been dismissed as ornamental, she now carried the air of experience, of a woman who had lived at the edge of history for decades and was no longer awed by its presence. But criticism did not ease. For women of her kind, society rarely offered mercy. It was said she was ambitious, calculating, ever hungry for the company of those who could elevate her. Perhaps this was true. Yet why should ambition be condemned when clothed in charm, while ambition clothed in speeches or in money was praised? Men were rarely judged so harshly for their hungers. In Pamela's case, the mere fact that she had not withdrawn into quiet domesticity seemed an offense to some. She was accused of being too visible, too persistent, too unwilling to fade. Yet in that persistence, there was a kind of defiance, a refusal to allow her narrative to be ended by others. Mystery grew around her in proportion to criticism. The less she defended herself, the more speculation thrived. Why did she remain always at the center of gatherings? Why did men continue to seek her company long after youthful beauty had softened into maturity? What was the secret of her magnetism? The answers varied. Some said it was her wit. others her attentiveness, still others her aura of belonging. But perhaps the real secret was simpler, that she was present without apology. In a world that expected women to shrink, to retreat, to apologize for aging, she did not. She entered each room as if she belonged, and in doing so, she made others believe it too. Her companionship with Harriman remained the defining thread of these years, though even this was not without complexity. They were not yet married, and whispers continued about the nature of their bond. To some, she was his mistress still, a figure clinging to his stature. To others, she was his partner in all but name, his equal in charm if not in office. Harriman himself seemed content in her company, relying on her to soften the edges of his statesman's gravitas, to keep him connected to the currents of life beyond officialdom. Together they moved through society as if bound by an unspoken pact. He lent her respectability, she lent him vitality, and each gave the other a form of endurance. There were quieter seasons too, moments when Pamela retreated to private spaces, when her days were less about parties and more about reflection. Friends who saw her then described a woman still lively, still elegant but also contemplative, aware of time's passing, aware that the decades had carried her far from the girl who once walked Dorset lanes. She spoke sometimes of her son, of her family, of her childhood. And in those conversations there was a tenderness that the public rarely glimpsed. It reminded those close to her that beneath the layers of reputation, beneath the titles of mistress and hostess, there remained a human heart that had known love and loss, joy and regret. And regret must surely have been part of her story. No one lives so publicly, so controversially, without moments of doubt. Did she regret her marriage to Randolph, its quick dissolution, its bitterness? Did she regret the affairs that had drawn both admiration and condemnation? Did she regret the years spent as an appendage to men who held power rather than holding power herself? Perhaps. And yet perhaps she also understood that regret is a luxury and that survival demands acceptance. She could not undo her past. She could only live it forward, transforming its fragments into something still whole. Her aura of mystery was heightened by the way others remembered her. Men spoke of her as unforgettable, women as untrustworthy, society as irresistible. Each description revealed more about the speaker than about Pamela herself. She had become a mirror, reflecting back the desires, fears, and judgments of those around her. And what is mystery if not the inability of others to agree on who we truly are? She embodied that uncertainty, and in doing so she became almost mythical, a figure larger than her own biography. As the 1970s unfolded, the world itself was changing. The old certainties of empire and tradition were dissolving. Social revolutions challenged the roles of women, of power, of influence. In this shifting context, Pamela seemed at once outdated and prophetic. Outdated because her life had been lived so much through association with powerful men. Prophetic because she refused to be erased, because she showed that a woman could craft her own presence in the world, even when denied official positions. She was both relic and pioneer, both scandal and icon. And so her middle years passed, not quietly, but with a strange resonance. She was spoken of less in gossip columns now, more in reflections, as though her life itself had become a symbol to be interpreted rather than merely a scandal to be recounted. In that interpretation lay her endurance. For to be forgotten is the true end, and Pamela was never forgotten. The sea laps against a quiet shore, swallowing old voices, and in that hushed rhythm one can imagine Pamela returning once more to Europe, a continent that had shaped her youth and defined her earliest reputation. The Atlantic lay behind her as both bridge and barrier, carrying her back to a world familiar yet altered, a world where the ruins of war had been rebuilt into boulevards and ministries, but where memories of loss still hovered like mist over the stones. Europe in the 1970s was neither the war-torn landscape of her beginnings nor the unscarred land of her childhood. It was something in between, something like Pamela herself, reconstructed, resilient, carrying traces of the past within the present. She returned not as the inexperienced bride of Randolph, nor as the whispered mistress of wartime rumor, but as a woman who had crossed oceans of both geography and reputation. Her years in America had given her stature. Her connection with Harriman lent her authority, and yet in Europe she carried a different aura, one shaped by her association with the Churchill name, that name still glowing with the afterlight of Winston's wartime leadership. Wherever she went, she remained linked, however distantly, to that towering figure, and people could not help but see in her both the shadow of his greatness and the reflection of his scandal. In Parisian salons and Roman villas, she was received with curiosity, sometimes with warmth, sometimes with wariness. France, with its long history of admiring women who wielded charm as influence, viewed her with a more sympathetic eye. Italy, with its passion for spectacle, welcomed her presence as one more brilliant figure in its already glittering society. England, however, remained more ambivalent, for the English memory is long, and many still recalled the storm of her early marriage, the whispers of wartime affairs. Some nodded politely, others withheld embrace, but all acknowledged her presence, for she could no longer be dismissed as a passing scandal. She had endured too long, adapted too well to be brushed aside. She seemed in these years to live as a traveler between worlds, never fixed, always moving, weaving friendships with diplomats, businessmen, actors, politicians. She carried herself with the assurance of one who had already survived the harshest judgments and therefore need not fear new ones. And yet, beneath the assurance, perhaps there was still the ache of estrangement, the faint sadness of knowing that she would never be fully embraced by the Churchill family, nor by English society as a whole. Her life had carried her too far from their expectations, and though she bore their name, she would never bear their approval. Still, Pamela was not a woman to dwell overlong on rejection. If one circle closed its doors, she simply turned toward another. Her friendships across Europe allowed her to glide through embassies and salons as though she were born to them. To some, she was the emblem of cosmopolitan elegance, a woman whose presence linked the old world to the new. To others, she remained a riddle, impossible to define. And in that riddle lay her strength. For a riddle demands attention, and Pamela never ceased to attract attention. In the quiet of European nights, she may have walked the streets of cities once shattered by war, remembering her younger self who had first stepped into those same cities when the air was thick with fear. Now the boulevards were lit with neon, the restaurants filled with laughter, the pavements crowded with youth who had no memory of blackouts or sirens. Did she feel herself belonging to their world or to the vanished world of her own youth? Perhaps she belonged to neither, existing instead in the space between memory and present, a space she had inhabited all her life, and always the name of Churchill followed her. Even when she was far from England, even when she was known more as Harriman's companion than as Randolph's widow, the Churchill name clung to her like a second skin. It was both curse and blessing, both burden and beacon. People wanted to know what she thought of Winston, of Clementine, of Randolph, of the great dynasty whose dramas had become part of British myth. She was careful, discreet, never offering too much, never contradicting the grandeur of the legend. But one imagines that in private she reflected more honestly, recalling moments of kindness and moments of coldness, remembering how the family had turned its back on her, even as the world remained fascinated. Her European sojourns were marked by moments of quiet intimacy as well as glittering gatherings. Friends recalled her capacity for listening, her gift for making others feel significant, her laughter that could warm even the most solemn rooms. But they also recalled her distance, her refusal to reveal herself fully, as though she had learned too well the dangers of transparency. Life had taught her that to be entirely known was to be entirely vulnerable, and Pamela had no intention of surrendering her defenses. Thus she gave pieces of herself, never the whole, offering warmth without complete disclosure, intimacy without total surrender. In these years she seemed almost like a portrait, admired for her elegance, debated for her meaning, never entirely alive to those who gazed upon her. Yet she was alive, deeply so, though her aliveness was often hidden beneath the roles others imposed upon her. She continued to adapt, to reinvent, to transform. The mistress of the past became the hostess of the present. The scandalous figure became the seasoned companion. The courtesan became, in time, a political presence in her own right. Her life was proof that identity is never fixed, that reputation can be both wound and weapon, that a woman may live many lives within a single span of years. And through it all, the memory of the Churchills lingered beside her, not as an anchor, but as a shadow. She was never entirely free of it, never able to escape the way others framed her story through that connection. Yet perhaps she no longer wished to escape. For shadows, too, can provide a kind of shelter, a context in which one's own outline is made visible. And so she walked Europe's boulevards, carrying her own history and the history of a family both distant and inescapable, a portrait that hung crooked on the wall of time, its eyes unblinking, its gaze both accusing and affirming. A portrait hangs crooked on the wall, its eyes unblinking, as though waiting for someone to adjust it, and yet no hand ever rises to make it straight. So it was with Pamela's life in the later decades, a portrait that others perceived as tilted, misaligned, scandalous in the eyes of some, luminous in the eyes of others, but which she herself left precisely as it was. For by the late 1970s and into the 1980s, Pamela's crooked portrait began to take on a new frame altogether, one painted not by gossip alone, but by politics itself. What had once been whispered scandal now slowly transformed into recognized influence, for she stepped not away from the public sphere, but further into it, embracing openly the role of hostess, fundraiser, and, in her own way, diplomat. It began quietly, as many of her transformations had, with evenings in Washington townhouses where the line between dinner party and political strategy blurred. The capital of America had long been a place where formal power resided in offices and chambers, but where real connections were forged in private salons, where food and conversation softened the sharp edges of policy. Pamela excelled in this world. She knew instinctively how to seat her guests so that their guarded silences gave way to unexpected confidences, how to balance laughter with seriousness, how to let a toast open the door to a negotiation. Men who entered her rooms as rivals sometimes left as allies, and though she held no office, her gatherings shaped the very atmosphere in which offices functioned. Her marriage to Averell Harriman at last gave her the formal position that society had long denied her. After decades of companionship, their union, though late, seemed almost inevitable. The closing of a circle begun in the shadows of wartime London. For Pamela, the marriage was not merely personal, but also symbolic. She was no longer mistress but wife, no longer scandalous companion but recognized partner. The crooked portrait remained, but now it hung in the halls of legitimacy, and those who had once scorned her were forced to acknowledge her resilience. With Harriman's name beside hers, she entered the political world of America more directly than ever before. Campaigns sought her support. Candidates courted her approval. Fundraisers relied on her gatherings. She became one of the most formidable hostesses in democratic politics, her salons legendary for their mixture of elegance and effectiveness. In her drawing rooms, money was raised not by demand but by charm. Support was won not by argument but by the subtle sense of belonging she cultivated among her guests. To give at Pamela's gatherings was not to fulfill an obligation, but to be part of a circle, a moment, a history in the making. Some marveled at her transformation, others scoffed. Was this not the same Pamela once dismissed as a courtesan? Was she not still, in essence, trading on beauty and charm? Yet the evidence was undeniable. She had moved beyond personal scandal into public consequence. Political campaigns rose upon the funds she gathered, candidates leaned upon the network she sustained, and in Washington her presence became not only accepted, but essential. Those who had once whispered against her now accepted her invitations gratefully, for to refuse them was to risk irrelevance. And still she remained enigmatic. She gave of herself generously in conversation, listening, encouraging, drawing others out, but she revealed little of her own inner world. Her strength was always in making others feel seen, rather than in declaring herself. Was this deliberate concealment, a strategy learned after decades of scrutiny? Or was it simply her nature, to exist always as both participant and observer, never fully surrendered to the gaze of others? Whatever the reason, it added to her aura. She was everywhere, known by all, yet still a mystery. In the glow of chandeliers and the hum of conversation, she must have sometimes reflected on the strange path her life had taken, from Dorset to Chartwell, from wartime scandal to Washington salons, from whispered disapproval to open recognition. Had she imagined, as a young bride in 1939, that one day senators and presidents would seek her counsel, that her gatherings would shape the course of campaigns, that her name would be invoked not only in gossip but in gratitude? Likely not. And yet, perhaps, she had always known that her life would not be ordinary, that the horizons she sought as a girl would carry her beyond the simple roles assigned to women of her station. The crooked portrait still hung, and always would. For there were those who never forgave, who continued to see in her only the scandalous mistress, the opportunist, the woman who used men as stepping stones. But history, like a wall of portraits, does not remove the crooked ones. It leaves them hanging, and over time they become part of the gallery, as integral as the straight ones. Pamela, by continuing to live visibly, had ensured that her crooked portrait would not be hidden in some attic of memory, but displayed where all might see it, argue over it, and perhaps even admire it. In this role as hostess and fundraiser, she found, at last, a kind of belonging. She had always lived in the spaces between love and influence, between scandal and admiration, between rejection and fascination. Now she had turned those spaces into a stage, and upon that stage she played her part with conviction. Politics became not a backdrop but a vocation, not a setting for her story but its very substance. And as she poured wine into crystal glasses, as she guided conversations gently from one subject to another, as she arranged her rooms with care so that every guest felt both honored and useful, she must have sensed that she had, in her own way, achieved a kind of power. Not the power of office, not the power of command, but the quieter power of presence, of influence, of making others move without ever appearing to push. Such power is often invisible, yet it is no less real. The clinking of glasses fades into silence, leaving only the faint aftertaste of wine on the tongue and the residue of conversation that lingers in the corners of a room after guests have departed. In that silence, questions arise, questions not asked aloud at her gatherings, but whispered in the hearts of those who observed Pamela, and even in the quiet chambers of her own reflection. What was the true nature of her charm, that force which carried her from Dorset fields to the drawing rooms of Washington? Was it ambition disguised as grace, survival masked by elegance, or something more elusive, something not easily contained by any single word? Charm is often dismissed as superficial, but in Pamela's case, it was a faculty deeper than appearance. She knew instinctively how to attune herself to the mood of a room, how to make each guest feel both significant and at ease, how to draw out confidences without appearing to pry. To some, this was calculated performance. To others, it was natural gift. But perhaps the distinction does not matter, for performance and authenticity are not always opposites. Sometimes performance is the truest form of expression, the shaping of oneself into the person one must be in order to survive. And Pamela, having endured scandal and disapproval, had long ago learned that survival required more than endurance alone. It required adaptability. Consider her trajectory, from a young wife scorned by her husband's infidelities, to a mistress condemned by society, to a hostess courted by politicians. At each stage, she faced the possibility of erasure, the danger that she might be cast aside, forgotten, diminished. Yet she never allowed herself to vanish. Each time, she reshaped herself into something new, drawing upon the same resource, her presence, her ability to turn attention into protection, gossip into fascination, suspicion into influence. Was this ambition? Surely. Yet ambition is rarely so patient, so subtle, so ready to wait in silence for the right moment. Her kind of ambition was not the hunger of conquest, but the hunger of survival, the determination never to be erased from the story. It is easy to see her only in relation to the men around her, Randolph Churchill, Averell Harriman, and the many others who crossed her path. Yet to do so is to miss the larger truth. Her life was not only about the men she loved or accompanied, it was about the way she transformed herself each time circumstances threatened to define her. She refused to be fixed in a single role. Mistress, wife, widow, mother, socialite, hostess, fundraiser, political presence. She carried all these titles, but she was never confined by any of them. She lived as though roles were garments to be worn and discarded as needed, and beneath them was a self that could never be wholly named. Still, society clung to its labels, calling her scandalous, opportunist, courtesan, even as they relied on her. The contradiction is striking. She was condemned for using charm as power, yet men used power with no apology. Perhaps her greatest transgression was not the affairs themselves, but the audacity of refusing shame. Women were expected to regret, to repent, to fade. Pamela did none of these. She stepped forward, unapologetic, and allowed the world to make of her what it would. In that refusal lay her deepest strength, and perhaps also her deepest loneliness. For to live without apology is to live without certain comforts, without the soft shelter of being forgiven. Her charm was also, perhaps, a shield. Those who saw her laughing at a banquet, radiant in a gown, believed they saw confidence, but beneath confidence there may have been the more fragile truth of self-preservation. When one has been judged too often, one learns to meet judgment with elegance, to disarm criticism with wit, to keep the deeper self hidden beneath layers of grace. And so she charmed not only to attract, but to protect, to keep the harsher winds of disapproval from touching the core of her being. Was this strategy conscious, or had it become second nature, as instinctive as breathing? Again, the question resists resolution. There were moments, however, when the mask slipped, when friends caught glimpses of vulnerability. They spoke of her kindness in private conversation, her ability to comfort those who were troubled, her loyalty to those she trusted. These qualities rarely made their way into the public narrative, overshadowed by gossip of her affairs and speculations about her ambitions. But they reveal that her charm was not only about manipulation, it was also about care, about the recognition that human beings long to be seen, and that to make someone feel significant is one of the most profound gifts one can give. And so, what was her charm? Ambition? Survival? Gift? Shield? Perhaps all these, blended into one. Perhaps charm itself is always a composite, a mystery woven of motives both noble and self-serving, both tender and calculating. To demand a single definition of it is to flatten its texture. Pamela lived her life refusing such flattening. She embodied contradiction, and that is why she endures in memory. Imagine her at the close of another evening, her guests departed, her rooms quiet, the echo of laughter fading into the stillness. She walks slowly among the empty glasses, the scattered napkins, the extinguished candles. Her gown rustles against the carpet, her shoes click softly on polished wood. She pauses by a window looking out into the night where the city glows with distant lights. Does she feel satisfaction in the evening's success or emptiness in its transience? Does she think of herself as powerful or as fragile? No one knows. She herself may not have known. But perhaps she accepted the uncertainty, living not in answers but in questions, not in definitions but in transitions. And as the night deepens, the silence becomes its own companion, reminding her that all charm, however powerful, is fleeting. The echo of conversation will vanish, the scent of flowers will fade, the laughter will dissolve. What remains is only the presence she carried, the impression she left upon those who entered her orbit. That presence was her true legacy, more enduring than any title, more lasting than any scandal. A door remains ajar, revealing nothing but darkness, and from that threshold she seemed to step into another chamber of her life, one not entirely new, but long awaited. For behind that half-open door lay the figure of Averell Harriman, the man whose presence had trailed through her story for decades, whose companionship had been constant even as seasons turned, whose shadow had lengthened beside her own. By the late 1970s, their long entanglement at last became formal, and Pamela became his wife. It was as though the room she had hovered outside for years was finally opened, not by chance but by inevitability, and she entered with a dignity both quiet and profound. The marriage to Harriman was not one of youthful passion nor sudden discovery, but of recognition. They had known each other through war, through diplomacy, through scandal, through whispers that had followed them across oceans. They had endured the weight of society's disapproval and the resilience of their own bond. By the time they stood together as husband and wife, theirs was not the fragile union of lovers beginning a story, but the seasoned partnership of companions whose story had already been long told in private. The vows confirmed what life itself had written, that they belong not in passing, but in permanence. For Pamela, this marriage was both vindication and transformation. Vindication because the woman once dismissed as mistress now stood openly as wife, her presence acknowledged, her role legitimized. Transformation because with Harriman's name formally beside hers, she moved fully into the sphere of politics and diplomacy, no longer as accessory but as participant. She was no longer merely attending the gatherings, she was hosting them, shaping them, making them her stage. The crooked portrait still hung on the wall, but now it was framed in gold. Harriman was by then a man of advanced years, his career storied, his health beginning to show the wear of time. Yet in Pamela's company, he seemed rejuvenated. Friends remarked on how her energy enlivened him, how her elegance brought new grace to his later life. To see them together was to witness the pairing of gravity and vitality, his seasoned authority balanced by her radiant presence. They complemented each other not by mirroring, but by contrast. He, the statesman with decades of achievement, she, the woman who had survived rumor and emerged as a power in her own right. The union altered how society regarded her. Those who had once scorned were forced to recalibrate. She was no longer only the scandalous figure of London's wartime gossip, but now the wife of one of America's elder statesmen. And in Washington, where perception often carries more weight than fact, that change of title mattered greatly. Invitations multiplied, respect followed, and even those who still harbored private doubts could not deny her new standing. The door once ajar had been opened, and she stepped fully into its light. But this light was not merely social, it was political. Pamela threw herself into Harriman's causes, his networks, his commitments. She became known not only for her beauty and charm, but for her effectiveness. She could raise funds with a single gathering, could bring together allies who otherwise mistrusted each other, could smooth the path of campaigns with her gracious persistence. She understood that politics was as much about atmosphere as about policy, and she excelled in shaping that atmosphere. Senators, governors, even future presidents passed through her salons, and many owed to her not only money but morale, the sense that they were part of something larger, something worthy. There is a quiet dignity in such work, though history rarely records it. Official documents mention speeches and votes, treaties and laws, but they rarely mention the evenings where laughter softened grudges, where introductions forged alliances, where a woman's presence made possible what formality could not. Pamela's marriage to Harriman placed her at the very center of this invisible yet essential sphere, and she, who had been so long accused of scandal, now wielded scandal's residue as proof of resilience, turning what had once been condemnation into recognition. Yet the story was not without irony. She had finally attained the legitimacy denied her in youth, yet it came not through her own name but through his. She bore the title of wife, the dignity of Harriman's standing, and in that title society finally accorded her respect. Did she ever resent that respect came only when sanctioned by a man's name? Did she feel the unfairness of a life in which her own survival, her own strength, her own adaptability had not been enough to silence critics until marriage bestowed its blessing? Perhaps she did, but if so, she did not show it. She accepted the role, transformed it, and made it her own. Their home together was filled with the rhythm of both companionship and purpose. Harriman, though older, remained active in politics and diplomacy, and Pamela stood beside him, not merely as spouse but as partner. They entertained constantly, their tables graced not only by crystal and silver, but by the voices of those shaping the future of nations. She moved among them with assurance, guiding the evening, ensuring that no guest felt neglected, no conversation faltered. The very art she had honed in scandal she now applied in service of politics, her charm no longer dismissed as manipulation but celebrated as gift. And yet, beneath the polished evenings, life carried its quieter moments. Harriman's health declined, his years heavy upon him, and Pamela became caretaker as well as companion. She tended him with devotion, her presence steady, her affection unwavering. For all the cynicism that surrounded their earlier years, their marriage proved tender, loyal, dignified. Those who witnessed them together in private saw not only politics, but love, not only ambition, but gentleness. The woman accused of seeking advantage revealed herself as a wife who remained faithful until the end, walking beside her husband through age as she once had through rumor. When Harriman died in 1986, Pamela was left not diminished but strengthened. She inherited not only his wealth, but his networks, his legacy, his place in American politics. And she did not retreat into widowhood. Instead, she advanced further into public life, stepping out from his shadow into her own. In this way, the marriage was not the culmination of her story, but the doorway to its final chapter, the chapter in which she would become not merely hostess or wife, but a political figure in her own right. A slow clock chimes in a distant hall, each note carrying both remembrance and renewal. And with those steady echoes, Pamela stepped into the chapter of her life that was perhaps the most unexpected of all. For after Averell Harriman's death in 1986, many assumed she would fade into quiet widowhood, her story already long told, her scandalous youth balanced by her dignified marriage. But Pamela had never lived according to the expectations of others, and she would not begin in her later years. Instead, she moved further into the world of politics and public life, reshaping herself once more, becoming not merely the hostess of influential evenings, but an active participant in the machinery of American democracy. Washington had long been familiar to her, its avenues lined with marble and memory, its air heavy with the rhetoric of statesmen. Yet now she entered it in her own right, no longer as companion but as figure. Her gatherings, not only social occasions, but strategic events upon which campaigns depended. She had inherited from Harriman not only wealth, but also networks, and she wielded both with a skill honed over decades of observation and experience. To candidates seeking support, she was indispensable. To parties planning their future, she was a force not easily ignored. The woman once dismissed as scandalous mistress had become one of the most formidable fundraisers in Democratic politics. Her salons became legendary. Within her home, conversations flowed across polished tables, and donations were pledged with the same ease as wine poured into glasses. Senators and governors, mayors and presidential hopefuls all passed through her rooms. They knew that Pamela possessed something rare, the ability to turn giving into belonging, to transform the cold act of writing a check into the warm experience of being part of her circle. She offered not only access but atmosphere, not only charm but conviction. And those who attended her gatherings left not merely lighter in purse, but firmer in resolve, buoyed by the sense that history itself was being shaped in her drawing rooms. Pamela had always known the importance of presence, but now she used it not only for herself, but for causes greater than her own survival. She raised millions for Democratic campaigns, supported candidates at every level, and became a trusted figure within the party. Though she never held office, her influence rivaled that of those who did. The irony was rich. The woman once condemned for her ambition was now celebrated for channeling that ambition into political effectiveness. What society had called manipulation when it served her own survival was now praised as leadership when it served the party's future. Yet even in her triumph, ambiguity lingered. Was her work in politics born of genuine conviction, or was it another reinvention, another stage upon which to ensure she was never forgotten? Perhaps the answer lies not in choosing one or the other, but in acknowledging that both can be true. Pamela had always sought to survive, but in surviving, she also discovered belief. Her loyalty to democratic ideals may have begun as association, but over time it became identity. She spoke passionately of justice, of opportunity, of America's role in the world, and those who heard her believed her sincerity. Survival had blossomed into purpose, and in that transformation lay her final reinvention. Her philanthropy also grew in these years. She supported the arts, championed cultural institutions, gave generously to causes that enriched public life. Friends and admirers described her as tireless, always planning another event, another fundraiser, another initiative. She seemed to draw energy from engagement, as if the rhythm of work itself kept her alive. Perhaps it did, for to retreat into silence would have been, for Pamela, a kind of death, and she was not ready to surrender to stillness. Her image, once so clouded by scandal, now began to shift in public memory. The younger generations who knew her only as a political hostess did not recall or did not care about the whispered affairs of wartime London. To them, she was a grande dame of the Democratic Party, a woman whose elegance masked steel, whose gatherings fueled campaigns, whose presence had become a fixture of Washington life. The crooked portrait on the wall no longer seemed crooked. It had become part of the gallery, its tilt transformed into character, its flaws into fascination. Still, the past was never fully erased. Older voices remembered, and critics continued to mutter. though now their words sounded less sharp and more weary, as if scandal had long since lost its edge. Pamela herself did not answer them. She had learned that survival lay not in rebuttal, but in endurance, and endurance was her truest talent. She carried herself with dignity, allowed others to interpret her as they wished, and continued her work with steady determination. Her influence was most visible during presidential campaigns, when her fundraising prowess became indispensable. Candidates knew that an evening at Pamela's home could transform their fortunes, that her support opened not only wallets, but hearts. She became a kind of oracle. Her approval sought, her presence courted, her gatherings celebrated. And though she never sought the spotlight directly, it seemed always to find her, drawn as if by magnet to the woman who had made herself impossible to ignore. Yet amidst the triumphs, one cannot help but wonder what private thoughts accompanied her. Did she ever look back on her youth with regret, or did she see it as the necessary foundation for her later influence? Did she feel satisfaction in having transformed scandal into statesmanship, or did she sometimes ache for the simplicity of being remembered without controversy? These questions, like so many in her life, remain unanswered. Pamela gave the world her presence, but never her full confession, and perhaps that is why her story endures. Mystery is more lasting than explanation. Her later years were marked not by decline, but by continued relevance, a rarity in any life. She remained central, still hosting, still raising, still shaping. Even as age touched her, she carried it with elegance, never retreating, never apologizing. She had outlived scandal, outlasted disapproval, and transformed herself again and again until she was no longer judged by her beginnings, but by her endurance. A typewriter's key remained stuck mid-word, its half-formed letter pressed stubbornly into the paper, refusing to move forward or erase itself. And in that frozen mark, one may see the irony of Pamela's later public life. For there she stood, once condemned and gossiped about, now celebrated and honored, her name pressed indelibly upon the fabric of political and social memory. The unfinished word of her reputation, once read as scandal, had been retyped by time into respectability. Yet the faint shadow of the earlier strokes still remained, a ghost beneath the ink, never wholly vanishing, reminding those who looked closely that history rarely grants erasure, only reinterpretation. By the late 1980s and into the 1990s, Pamela had become something rare, a woman whose very presence was itself a kind of institution. She was no longer merely Averell Harriman's widow, nor simply a hostess of influence, but a symbol of endurance. Politicians who had once whispered doubts about her motives now bowed to her significance, eager for her approval. Young candidates courted her favor as though it were a seal of legitimacy, and older statesmen praised her as a grande dame, forgetting or pretending to forget the sharper judgments they once cast upon her. The courtesan of gossip had become the matriarch of memory. This irony did not escape her. Friends recalled that she carried her new role with dignity, but also with a glimmer of amusement. She knew better than most how easily society revises its judgments, how quickly condemnation can become admiration when time has softened the edges of scandal. Perhaps she smiled inwardly at the same voices that once excluded her now inviting her, the same pens that once sketched her as a danger now sketching her as an icon. But if she savored the irony, she did so silently, never boasting, never retaliating. She had learned that survival requires patience, and patience had brought her this reversal. Her gatherings in Washington became almost ceremonial. To be invited to Pamela Harriman's home was to be included in the inner circle of the Democratic Party, to be counted among those who mattered. Her dinners were no longer mere fundraisers, but rituals of belonging, each one carefully orchestrated to blend elegance with purpose. Crystal glasses, polished silver, the hum of voices rising and falling like a tide, all of it shaped an atmosphere in which politics was softened into fellowship, where giving became not obligation but pleasure. In these rooms, deals were smoothed, alliances confirmed, ambitions nurtured. And though she never stood at a podium, her influence was felt in the applause that followed speeches made elsewhere. Public recognition followed. Newspapers wrote not of her scandals, but of her effectiveness. Profiles described her as a force in American politics, a woman whose elegance masked a steely determination. Awards and honors came, tokens of appreciation for her philanthropy and her political work. To the younger generation, she was no longer the notorious Pamela of wartime London, but the formidable Pamela Harriman, a figure as respected as any senator, as indispensable as any strategist. The typewriter key that once stalled on the word scandal now struck out words like influence, grace, and statesmanship, yet the shadow of irony remained. Was she truly celebrated for what she had always been? Or had society merely grown comfortable with the passage of time, repackaging her story into something it could praise without discomfort? Was she honored for her transformation, or for the ability to endure until the world itself changed around her? These questions lingered, unanswered, for Pamela herself did not speak them. She accepted the honors with grace, carried the titles with dignity, and continued her work as if the earlier condemnations had never existed. But one suspects she remembered them, if only as reminders of how fickle human judgment can be. There is a lesson in her later years, one that extends beyond her personal story, that history often rewards those who endure, not necessarily those who are innocent or virtuous, but those who refuse to vanish. Pamela had endured longer than her critics, longer than her rivals, longer than many of the men who once defined her reputation. She had outlasted them, and in outlasting, she had inherited the privilege of reinterpretation. The scandal that once clung to her name had been rewritten into resilience. The affairs that once condemned her now framed as steps in a larger journey toward significance. Memory had shifted, and she had allowed it to shift without resistance, knowing that time itself was her ally. Her aura of mystery deepened with this transformation. The young woman who once drew gossip in London drawing rooms was now an elderly stateswoman of sorts, yet still elusive, still difficult to define. Guests at her dinners marveled at how she seemed to know everyone, to remember every detail, to connect each guest to another with uncanny precision. Yet when they attempted to speak of her beyond the evening, they found they could not fully capture her essence. She had given them presence, charm, attention, but not herself. The secret of her inner life remained locked, her true feelings sealed. This secrecy, long a shield, was now a crown, for it allowed her to embody whatever image others needed of her. Imagine her in these final decades, moving slowly but still with poise, her gowns tailored carefully, her jewels understated but perfect, her smile unbroken. She stands at the head of a long table, raising a glass, her eyes glancing from guest to guest, each feeling chosen, each feeling significant. In that moment, she embodies not scandal, not survival, but legacy. And when the glasses are set down and the guests depart, she sits in the quiet, listening, perhaps to the faint tick of a clock, aware that she has turned her life into a narrative stronger than the facts, a story that will outlast her body. A veil of smoke curls upward, refusing to settle, drifting as though it cannot decide whether to vanish into air or linger in the room. And in that indecision, one finds the mood of Pamela's final years. For she, too, existed in a space between presence and absence, between the legacy she had so carefully crafted and the solitude that time inevitably brings. By the 1990s, she had lived more than 7 decades, and each decade had written upon her a different story, yet none had erased the others. She was at once scandal and stateswoman, courtesan and hostess, widow and matriarch, and in her later years she carried the weight of all these identities like garments layered one upon another, never entirely shed. The salons continued, though at a gentler pace. The room still glowed with conversation, the glasses still clinked, the donations still flowed, but the gatherings bore a quieter tone, as though memory itself had taken a seat at the table. Younger politicians entered her orbit, eager to receive her blessing, to bask in the aura of a woman whose life had touched so many eras, whose eyes had witnessed the war, the rebuilding, the campaigns of a dozen presidents. They regarded her not with suspicion, as earlier generations had, but with reverence, as though she were living history, and perhaps she was. Few could claim to have moved so seamlessly from the darkened corridors of the Blitz to the bright lights of Washington fundraisers, from scandal's shadow to society's recognition. Yet when the guests departed and silence reclaimed the rooms, Pamela must have felt the solitude that comes to all who have lived long. For charm, however enduring, does not banish loneliness, and influence does not replace intimacy. Her evenings ended as all evenings do, with lights dimmed, gowns folded away, voices fading into memory. In those quiet hours she may have thought of the many men who had passed through her life. Randolph, reckless and absent; Harriman, steady and devoted; the countless others whose companionship had been fleeting yet formative. Some were gone, their names etched into headstones or history books, their voices silenced. She remained the survivor, the one who endured. And survival, though triumphant, is never free of ache. Her son remained a connection to her earlier life, though their relationship, like much of her story, was complicated, threaded with both affection and distance. Friends observed her pride in him, but also her awareness that her own life had often drawn her away from the steady role of mother. Did she regret those absences? Did she feel that survival had required sacrifices not only of reputation but of closeness? Perhaps. Yet regret was never a garment Pamela wore openly. If she carried it silently, folded into the private chambers of her heart. In these final years, she also bore the burden of being remembered in multiple, conflicting ways. For some, she was still the scandalous beauty who had seduced her way through the corridors of power. For others, she was the grande dame of democratic politics, the hostess whose dinners sustained campaigns. For others still, she was a symbol of endurance, proof that a woman could outlast condemnation and reshape her narrative. To live beneath so many gazes is to live with a constant awareness of self as performance. And perhaps Pamela had so long performed that performance itself had become her truth. Yet truth, in her case, was not a single point, but a spectrum, shimmering, elusive, always resisting final definition. There is a poignancy in imagining her sitting by a window in Washington, the Potomac glinting in late afternoon light, her hand resting on the arm of a chair, her thoughts drifting. Does she see in the river's flow the passage of her own life, swift, ceaseless, carrying away each moment, even as it brings another? Does she remember the Dorset fields of her youth, the bomb-scarred streets of London, the glittering boulevards of Paris, the bright pools of Hollywood gardens, the polished wood of American drawing rooms? All these places lived within her, not as nostalgia, but as layers, each one shaping the way she met the present. Perhaps in that window's reflection she glimpsed not one self but many, a chorus of lives contained within a single body. Her health began to falter, as health inevitably does, and the vitality that had long sustained her gatherings dimmed. Yet even then, she remained poised, refusing to let age rob her of dignity. Friends who saw her in those years spoke of her elegance, undiminished by frailty, her mind still sharp, her presence still commanding. She never surrendered to invisibility, never allowed herself to fade into the background. If life was to close its door, she would stand at its threshold with her head held high, her portrait still crooked but unmistakably present on the wall of history. And what of love in those final years? Harriman's absence was a void, and no later companion filled it. She had known passion, she had known companionship, she had known scandal and stability, but now she knew solitude. Yet solitude, too, can be its own kind of companionship, offering the chance to dwell with memory, to converse with ghosts. Perhaps she welcomed that quiet company, for she had lived always surrounded by voices, and at the end, perhaps the only voice she needed was her own. Her last public years were marked by a paradoxical mixture of visibility and retreat. She remained active in politics, still fundraising, still hosting, but she also began to withdraw into the smaller circle of trusted friends. Public memory celebrated her. Private moments likely reminded her of the cost of such a life. To be remembered is to be divided, for each person remembers a different fragment, and Pamela's fragments were many. She lived with the knowledge that no one would ever hold her whole, that her truth was scattered across too many rooms, too many conversations, too many whispered stories. Yet perhaps this was her triumph, to remain, to endure, to be remembered at all. For many who once walked beside her had been forgotten, their names erased by time, their scandals lost in the dust. Pamela's scandal, however, had become her story, and her story had become her legacy. She had made herself unforgettable, not by pleading innocence, but by embodying contradiction. And in contradiction lies fascination, and in fascination lies endurance. A letter remains sealed, hidden in a drawer, its paper yellowing slightly with age, its words never revealed. It could have been a letter of confession, or of longing, or of nothing more than daily detail. But by being sealed, it became something else entirely, a symbol of all that Pamela left unsaid. When she died in 1997, suddenly and unexpectedly while serving as the United States ambassador to France, that sealed letter seemed to stand for her whole life. A story of presence and silence, of memory and mystery, of words spoken in salons but withheld in solitude. Her passing closed a door that had long stood half open, leaving behind echoes that were neither uniform nor reconciled. Her death came not in retreat but in service, a fact that startled even those who thought they knew her best. At 76 years of age, she had been appointed ambassador by President Bill Clinton, a recognition not only of her political fundraising prowess, but of her enduring influence in American public life. It was the culmination of her long transformation, from scandalous mistress to political hostess, to finally diplomat in her own right. That she died in Paris, the city of salons and of history, seemed almost too fitting, as though the stage on which she had lived her many lives had been chosen for her final act. News of her death spread quickly, and the responses were as divided as the memories of her life. To some, she was celebrated as a woman of extraordinary resilience, who had turned every scandal into survival, every dismissal into reinvention. Obituaries spoke of her as an emblem of political elegance, a bridge between Europe and America, a hostess who had become a force in her own right. They praised her fundraising, her diplomacy, her presence. To others, however, she remained what she had always been, controversial, opportunist, scandalous. They recalled the affairs, the gossip, the disapproval of the Churchills, the whispers that had trailed her name through the decades. Death had not erased the contradictions, it had only heightened them. In England, her passing stirred old memories. The Churchill family, long wary of her, acknowledged her with formality but little warmth. She had been both part of their story and apart from it, forever linked by marriage yet forever estranged by choice and circumstance. In America, by contrast, She was hailed with admiration, remembered as one of the great political hostesses of her time, a woman whose work had sustained the Democratic Party through lean years, whose gatherings had nurtured alliances that shaped campaigns and policies. France, where she had served her final role, honored her with dignity, recognizing her as both diplomat and symbol of the bond between nations. And what of those who had known her personally, who had sat at her tables, laughed at her wit, leaned close to whisper confidences in her ear? Their memories were no doubt more complicated still, for each saw in Pamela what they needed to see, and each remembered her differently. To some she was warmth and kindness, to others calculation and control. To some she was unforgettable, to others untrustworthy, and perhaps all were true. For Pamela had lived as a mirror, reflecting back the desires and fears of those around her, and in doing so, she became many things at once. Her funeral carried the weight of this ambiguity. It was attended by the powerful and the curious alike, by those who honored her and those who judged her, all gathered in the same silence. The eulogies spoke of resilience, of elegance, of service. The unspoken words in the air spoke of scandal, of rumor, of the lives entangled with hers. Even in death, she could not be confined to a single narrative. She was too complex, too contradictory, too alive in memory to be smoothed into uniformity. And perhaps that is why her death felt not like an end, but like a continuation. For she had always lived between definitions, between admiration and disapproval, between scandal and recognition. Her passing did not resolve those tensions. It only preserved them, sealed them like the unopened letter in the drawer. She left the world not with a confession, but with a question. Who was Pamela Churchill Harriman truly? Was she opportunist or survivor, manipulator or muse, scandalous mistress or legitimate stateswoman? The answer depends on the eye of the beholder, and perhaps that is her truest legacy, that no one can answer the question fully, that her life resists conclusion. Imagine her in those last days, walking through the halls of the American Embassy in Paris, her steps still graceful, her mind still sharp, her presence still commanding. She carries within her the weight of decades, yet also the lightness of one who has always lived in motion, never fixed, never defined. And then, as suddenly as a candle extinguished, she is gone, leaving only the memory of her footsteps, the echo of her voice, the contradictions of her story. For some, her death was the closing of a scandalous tale. For others, it was the culmination of a triumph, proof that a woman could rise above condemnation and write her own destiny. For all, it was a reminder that lives are not easily categorized, that memory reshapes itself, that history is a crooked portrait whose gaze follows us even after the eyes have closed. Bells toll faintly, carried by the evening air, their sound neither mournful nor triumphant, but steady, as though reminding those who listen that time itself continues, indifferent to the lives that rise and fall beneath its chimes. And yet, within those tolls lies remembrance, and in remembrance lies the fragile legacy of Pamela Churchill Harriman. Her story, like the bells, resounds beyond her passing, sometimes in clear tones, sometimes in muffled echoes, never wholly in harmony, yet never fading entirely. For she remains, even now, a figure caught between scandal and reverence, between condemnation and admiration, between the intimacy of personal choices and the grandeur of public history. What is one to make of such a life? It is tempting to simplify, to draw clean lines where there were none, to call her opportunist, or survivor, or manipulator, or muse, to say she lived for power, or for love, or for endurance, alone. But human lives do not conform to single meanings, and Pamela's least of all. Her story is a tapestry woven from contradictions, a portrait whose crookedness is part of its truth. She was both a woman who sought affection and a woman who wielded charm as power. She was both condemned for her ambition and celebrated for her resilience. She was both shadow and light, silence and presence, wound and weapon. Her life suggests that survival is itself a form of power, especially for those whom society seeks to erase. For Pamela endured. She endured the disapproval of the Churchills, the whispers of London, the scorn of newspapers, the suspicion of rivals. She endured widowhood and loneliness, endured the passage of youth, endured the constant gaze of others who insisted on defining her. And in that endurance, she transformed. Each time society tried to confine her to a single role, scandalous mistress, discarded wife, courtesan of influence, she slipped into another, remaking herself until the very act of reinvention became her essence. In this way, she triumphed, not by silencing her critics, but by outlasting them. And yet endurance alone cannot explain her. There was something else, something more elusive that kept her name alive when others faded. Perhaps it was her gift for presence, that rare ability to make others feel significant, to turn attention outward even while drawing it inward. Those who met her rarely forgot her, not because she imposed herself, but because she reflected them. She gave to others the sensation of being seen, and in that gift lay her greatest influence. For influence is not always the power to command. Often it is the power to make others believe more deeply in themselves. Pamela mastered that art, whether by instinct or design. Her story also reveals the ways in which history itself is written, not as a fixed truth, but as a shifting memory, reshaped by time, retold by voices with differing aims. In one telling, she is a scandal, a woman who used beauty as currency. In another, she is a pioneer, a woman who refused to accept erasure. In yet another, she is a symbol of elegance, a stateswoman of society who turned salons into stages of diplomacy. Which is true? Perhaps all, perhaps none. For truth, in her case, is not a single point but a spectrum, shimmering, elusive, always resisting conclusion. As the 20th century drew to its close, she died in Paris, far from the Dorset fields of her childhood, far from the Chartwell halls where her marriage had faltered, far from the bomb-shattered streets of wartime London where her story of scandal had begun. She died not as mistress or scandal, but as ambassador, carrying the title of official responsibility, representing a nation in the city of her final chapter. That, too, was irony. For the woman who had so long lived in shadows and whispers ended her life in the open light of diplomacy. It was as if history itself had decided to complete her transformation, to write her ending not in scandal, but in service. And so the question remains, what does Pamela Churchill Harriman's life signify? Was it the triumph of charm, proving that presence and wit can shape destinies as much as office and speech? Was it the scandal of survival, showing that ambition and adaptability can carry a woman farther than convention ever allows? Or was it something subtler, the fragile line between love and history, reminding us that the choices of the heart are never free from the judgments of society, and that personal lives can never be disentangled from public memory? Perhaps it was all these at once. Her story is less a lesson than a reflection, less a map than a mirror. For in her contradictions, we glimpse our own. We, too, live between roles, between how others see us and how we see ourselves, between the stories told about us and the truths we withhold. Pamela simply lived this more visibly, more dramatically, her life magnified by proximity to power. But in essence, her story is the story of being human, of longing for love, of seeking survival, of desiring recognition, of enduring judgment. And now, as the bells fall silent and the evening deepens, we are left not with certainty, but with contemplation. The scandalous life of Pamela Churchill was not one to be tidied into neat conclusions. It was a life of smoke that never settled, of portraits that never hung straight, of doors that never closed fully. It was a life of contradictions embraced rather than denied, a life that remains even now unresolved.